Pay close attention to this man. In the presence of his wife, he was engaging in disturbing behavior that would soon be followed by something far more horrific. Shortly afterward, he would kill his wife, then call 911 claiming she had been shot. When authorities arrived, they found her lying on the floor beside their bed, bleeding from gunshot wounds. The man told police a story, but it was a lie.
How many shots did you hear?
2.
You heard 2?
And I thought it was a balloon at first.
His name was Keith Johansen. His wife was 25-year-old Brandi Celenza. Investigators would later realize that Johansen wasn't panicking or attempting to save his wife. Instead, he was moving through the house, possibly concealing evidence, while a 6-year-old boy, Brandi's son, was somewhere inside the home, having just witnessed something no child should ever see. This is the story of a marriage built on control and abuse, a murder that destroyed a family, and a killer who spent years trying to escape justice, spinning a web of lies that ultimately led to a life sentence without parole. The morning of April 7th, 2018, unfolded in ways that only Keith Johansen fully understands. What we know comes from the physical evidence, from the 911 call, from what Brandi's son told investigators, and from the home surveillance video that would later contradict nearly everything Johansen claimed. At some point that morning, something happened between Keith and Brandi. Maybe they argued. Maybe tensions that had been building for days or weeks finally exploded. Maybe Johansen simply made a calculated decision that he was done with the marriage and wanted Brandi gone. Whatever the trigger, the situation escalated to violence. Brandi's 6-year-old son was somewhere in the house when it happened. He was present, aware that something was wrong, listening to sounds that no child should ever hear. According to what the boy later told investigators, he heard his mother scream.
And my mom, she went to the hospital.
He did hear his mother scream.
And then I heard 2 gunshots.
And there's cameras all around. We always want those.
Not a surprise scream, not a startled yelp. A scream of terror, of someone who knows something terrible is about to happen. And then he heard gunshots. Keith Johansen shot his wife twice. The first shot didn't kill her immediately, so he fired again. One of the bullets was a rubber bullet, a detail that would later prove crucial in destroying Johansen's claims that this was an accident or suicide. You don't accidentally fire a rubber bullet and then a regular bullet at yourself. That's not how accidental shootings work. That's not how suicides happen. Brandi collapsed near the couple's bed. She was bleeding, dying her life, draining away on the floor of her own home, while her 6-year-old son was somewhere nearby, terrified and confused. And Keith Johansen, instead of immediately calling for help, instead of trying to save the woman he claimed to love, took time to think about what he was going to say. When Johansen finally called 911, his demeanor immediately struck the dispatcher as wrong. Something about his tone, his words, his priorities didn't match what you'd expect from someone who had just discovered their spouse dying from gunshot wounds. He claimed he had been in the shower when he heard 2 gunshots. He said he came out to find Brandi on the floor, bleeding. The dispatcher, following standard protocol for medical emergencies, gave Johansen clear instructions. Apply pressure to the wounds. Try to stop the bleeding. Do everything possible to keep Brandi alive until paramedics could arrive. These are basic, life-saving measures that anyone can perform. You don't need medical training to press a towel against a wound and try to slow blood loss. But Johansen refused. His excuse was bizarre and immediately suspicious. He said he was wet and slippery from his shower and didn't want to slide around. He was more concerned about being wet than about his wife bleeding to death. Think about that for a moment. Your spouse is dying on the floor in front of you, and your primary concern is that you might slip because you're wet. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't reflect how people actually behave in genuine emergencies when someone they love is in danger. The dispatcher pressed him. Apply pressure, help her, save her life. But Johansen continued to refuse, offering excuse after excuse. He said he couldn't see the blood clearly. He said he didn't want to touch the wound. He repeatedly mentioned that he never touched the gun, emphasizing this point multiple times as if establishing it for the record. Investigators would later suspect that while Johansen was on that 911 call, refusing to help his dying wife, he was actually moving through the house. He may have been concealing evidence, disposing of something, staging the scene to support whatever story he was planning to tell. The call went on for an extended period, and throughout it, Johansen's behavior remained cold, detached, and focused on protecting himself rather than saving Brandi. He even suggested to the dispatcher that Brandi had wanted to shoot herself. He was already trying to plant the idea of suicide before investigators even arrived. He was building his narrative in real time, testing it out on the 911 dispatcher to see if it would fly. By the time paramedics arrived at the home on Felter Lane, it was too late. Brandi Celenza was pronounced dead. She had been shot twice, once with a regular bullet and once with a rubber bullet. The wounds were fatal. Her young son had lost his mother. And Keith Johansen, standing there wet from his supposed shower, began telling the first of many stories about how his wife had died. The initial investigation moved cautiously. Sheriff Rick Stolley and the Flagler County Sheriff's Office knew they were dealing with a suspicious death, but they needed to build a solid case. They collected evidence from the scene. They interviewed Johansen multiple times. They spoke with Brandi's son as gently as possible given his age and trauma. They analyzed the home surveillance video. And with each piece of evidence they gathered, Johansen's story became less and less believable. The 911 call was just the beginning. As investigators dug deeper into what happened on April 7th, every piece of evidence they uncovered contradicted Keith Johansen's version of events. The case began to look less like a tragic accident or suicide and more like a calculated murder that Johansen had tried and failed to cover up. The home surveillance video proved to be particularly damning. Johansen had claimed he was in the shower when the shots were fired, that he heard the gunshots and rushed out to find Brandi already shot. But the surveillance footage told a different story. The timeline didn't match his claims. The video showed movements and activities that contradicted his supposed alibi. Investigators realized that Johansen's shower story was a fabrication, a lie designed to create physical separation between himself and the shooting. Then there was the testimony from Brandi's 6-year-old son. Interviewing a child witness, especially one who has just lost his mother and witnessed a traumatic event, is extraordinarily delicate. Investigators had to be careful, gentle, and patient. But what the boy told them was crucial. He heard his mother scream before the gunshot, not after, before. The physical evidence from the shooting itself raised more questions. Brandi had been shot twice. One bullet was a standard round. The other was a rubber bullet. This detail was critical because it demolished any suggestion of accidental discharge or suicide. If Brandi had accidentally shot herself, why would there be two different types of ammunition? If she was suicidal, why would she load her gun with a rubber bullet and a regular bullet? It made no sense. But it made perfect sense if someone else was shooting her. Maybe the first shot with the rubber bullet didn't do what Johansen intended, so he fired again with regular ammunition to finish the job. The weapon used was a Canik handgun, not Brandi's gun, but Johansen's. This would become important later when Johansen tried to argue that investigators should have tested Brandi's gun for DNA. The prosecution would point out the obvious. Brandi wasn't shot with her own gun, so testing it was irrelevant. She was shot with Johansen's weapon, which he had already admitted to handling. On April 27, 2018, 20 days after Brandi's death, Keith Johansen was arrested, but even after his arrest, Johansen couldn't keep his story straight. In fact, he would tell at least 3 completely different versions of what happened, each one more desperate than the last. First, he claimed Brandi had accidentally shot herself, that she was handling the gun and it went off. When that story fell apart under scrutiny, he changed tactics and blamed Brandi's 6-year-old son. He suggested that the child had somehow got hold of the gun and shot his own mother. Think about the level of cruelty it takes to blame a traumatized 6-year-old for his mother's death. Think about what that accusation would do to a child who was already dealing with unimaginable loss and trauma. The multiple contradictory stories Keith Johansen told weren't just damaging to his credibility. They revealed something deeply disturbing about who he was as a person. Each new version of events showed a man willing to say absolutely anything, to blame anyone, including a child, to manipulate any narrative if it might help him escape responsibility for murder. Judge Dawn Nichols, who would oversee the case, had to set strict ground rules for the trial. She was concerned about potential prejudicial courtroom antics from family members in the gallery. Emotions were running high on both sides. Brandi's family was devastated and angry. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a mother. They wanted justice. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecution built their case methodically, piece by piece. They had the 911 call, which demonstrated Johansen's suspicious behavior and lack of concern for his dying wife. They had the surveillance video that contradicted his timeline. They had the testimony about Brandi's scream before the shooting. They had the physical evidence of 2 different types of bullets, proving this wasn't a simple accident. And they had Johansen's own contradictory statements, each one proving he was willing to lie to save himself. The prosecution argued that this was premeditated murder. The evidence suggested Johansen had planned this, or at minimum had made a deliberate decision to kill his wife during their argument. The scream before the shooting indicated Brandi knew what was about to happen. She wasn't surprised by an accidental discharge. She wasn't calmly handling a weapon. She was terrified, screaming for her life, knowing her husband was about to shoot her. And then there was the rubber bullet detail. Prosecutors argued this proved Johansen had intentionally loaded different ammunition, possibly testing the rubber bullet first to see if it would do the job without making as much noise or leaving as much evidence. When it didn't kill Brandi, he switched to regular ammunition. It showed planning, deliberation, consciousness of what he was doing. On October 28, 2021, after hearing all the evidence and testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. They had to decide, was Keith Johansen guilty of first-degree murder? The charge of first-degree murder requires proof of premeditation, that the killing was planned and deliberate, not a spontaneous act or an accident. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 50 minutes. That's actually relatively quick for a murder trial of this complexity. It suggested the evidence was clear, the conclusion obvious. When they returned to the courtroom, the verdict was unanimous, guilty of first-degree murder. Judge Don Nichols sentenced Johansen to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again. Johansen reportedly appeared prepared for this outcome. He held out his hands for handcuffs as soon as the sentence was read, as if he'd known all along that his lies wouldn't save him. Keith Johansen is serving life in prison without parole for the first-degree murder of Brandi Celenza. But even years after his conviction, Johansen couldn't accept responsibility for what he'd done. In September 2025, he filed motions challenging his conviction, claiming his trial attorney had been ineffective. He argued that Wood should have filed a stand-your-ground motion, should have called the child to testify, should have tested Brandi's gun for DNA. Each argument was systematically dismantled by the court, which noted that Johansen's own lies and contradictory statements had made mounting any effective defense nearly impossible. Brandi Celenza was 25 years old when she died. Those who knew her described her as vibrant, full of life, a dedicated young mother who loved her 6-year-old son more than anything in the world. She had dreams like anyone else, dreams of raising her child in a safe home, dreams of a stable family life, dreams of growing old and watching her son grow into a man. But somewhere along the way, Brandi's life had taken a dark turn. She had married Keith Johansen, a man who would prove to be nothing like the person he appeared to be on the surface. To outsiders, they might have seemed like a normal couple living in their home on Felter Lane in Palm Coast, Florida. Just another family in a quiet neighborhood, raising a child, going about their daily lives. Domestic abuse isn't always visible. It doesn't always leave bruises that others can see. Sometimes it's psychological, constant criticism, isolation from friends and family, financial control, threats, intimidation. The abuser creates an environment where the victim feels trapped, where leaving seems impossible or more dangerous than staying. And often, by the time people on the outside realize what's happening, it's too late. Brandi lived with Keith and her young son in their home. Every day, she navigated the volatile environment that Johansen had created. She was a mother trying to protect her child while surviving in a relationship that was becoming increasingly dangerous. What Brandi didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her husband was capable of murder. That the man she had married, the man she lived with, the father figure in her son's life, was eventually going to make a decision that would end her life and traumatize her child forever. Brandi Celenza's family continues to grieve the loss of a vibrant young woman whose life was stolen by domestic violence. Her son Riley is growing up without his mother, carrying trauma that will likely affect him for the rest of his life. The community of Palm Coast was shaken by this tragedy, reminded that behind closed doors, even in quiet neighborhoods, darkness can exist. Brandi's legacy is a reminder to recognize the signs of domestic abuse and to help victims escape before it's too late.